Baby discovered a bear cub stuck in a tennis court storage. What Baby did next was a perfect match. The morning mist hung low over the abandoned park, creating a world that seemed suspended between dreams and waking. Ethan Marshall walked slowly along the cracked pathway, his 2-year-old daughter Haley's tiny hand wrapped around his finger. The air carried that particular quality of early autumn mornings, where every sound seemed muffled and distant, as if the world itself was still half asleep. Haley had insisted on this walk, pointing at the door with determination that only toddlers possess, her bright eyes full of purpose that Ethan couldn't quite understand. She wore her favorite yellow raincoat even though no rain was expected, the hood bouncing with each of her unsteady but enthusiastic steps. The park had been closed for years, but locals still used the walking paths that wound through the overgrown grass and past the forgotten playground equipment. Everything here had a story of better days, from the rusted swing chains to the basketball hoops without nets. But there was something peaceful about the decay, something that spoke of nature slowly reclaiming what had always belonged to it. Haley suddenly stopped, her head tilting to one side in that way children do when they hear something adults have learned to ignore. She pulled her hand free from Ethan's grip and began toddling toward the old tennis courts, her little legs moving with surprising determination. Ethan followed, not alarmed, but curious about what had captured his daughter's attention. The tennis court fence was twisted and broken in places, the green surface cracked like a dried riverbed, with weeds pushing through every available space. At the far end of the court stood a storage shed, its wooden walls weathered gray and its door hanging slightly ajar. That's when Ethan heard it too, a soft whimpering sound, barely audible above the morning breeze rustling through the trees. Haley was already at the shed door, pushing it open with both hands, and Ethan quickened his pace, a flutter of concern rising in his chest. The inside of the shed was dim, dust particles dancing in the single shaft of light that entered through a broken window. Old tennis equipment lay scattered about, rackets with broken strings, deflated balls, and tangled nets creating a maze of forgotten sports dreams. But there, in the corner, something moved. Ethan's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and his breath caught in his throat. A bear cub, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, was trapped in a mess of old tennis netting, its fur matted and its dark eyes wide with fear. The cub couldn't have been more than a few months old. Its paws tangled so thoroughly that every movement only seemed to tighten the synthetic ropes around its small body. Ethan's first instinct was to grab Haley and back away, his mind racing through every piece of advice he'd ever heard about encountering bears. Never get between a cub and its mother, they said. But as he reached for his daughter, something extraordinary happened that made him freeze in place. Haley sat down on the dusty floor, crossing her legs in that clumsy way toddlers do, and began patting the ground with her small palm. The rhythm was simple, 3 quick pats followed by 2 slow ones, repeated over and over. The whimpering stopped. The cub's eyes, which had been darting frantically around the shed, focused entirely on the little girl. Then, impossibly, the cub lifted one paw as much as the netting would allow and tapped the same rhythm against the wooden floor. 3 quick taps, 2 slow ones. Haley giggled, a sound of pure delight, and changed the pattern. This time, it was 2 taps, a pause, then 3 more. The cub watched intently, its small head tilted, and after a moment repeated the new pattern perfectly. Ethan stood frozen, watching this impossible conversation unfold between his baby daughter and a wild animal that should have been terrified or aggressive, but was instead engaged in what could only be described as communication. The morning light shifted slightly, illuminating more of the shed's interior, and Ethan could see the cub more clearly now. Its fur was a rich brown with lighter patches around its ears and muzzle, and despite its predicament, it didn't appear injured, just thoroughly tangled. Haley reached into her pocket and pulled out her most treasured possession, a small stuffed star that went everywhere with her. It was worn from love, one point slightly chewed, its yellow fabric faded from countless washes. She placed it carefully on the ground between herself and the cub, then scooted back slightly, as if giving the animal space to consider her offering. The cub sniffed the air, its small black nose twitching, and made a soft huffing sound that almost seemed like acknowledgement. Ethan knew he needed to free the animal, but he was mesmerized by the interaction, by the complete absence of fear from either participant in this strange meeting. Moving slowly, speaking in soft, reassuring tones, more for his own benefit than anyone else's, Ethan approached the tangled cub. Haley watched him with serious eyes, as if she understood the importance of what was happening. The cub tensed slightly as Ethan drew near, but Haley resumed her patting pattern, and the small bear relaxed, its attention split between father and daughter. The netting was wound tight, years of abandonment having created a web that seemed designed to trap unwary creatures. Ethan pulled out his pocket knife, its blade small but sharp enough for the task. He began cutting carefully, aware that one wrong move could injure the cub or cause it to panic. With each strand that fell away, the cub seemed to understand what was happening, remaining remarkably still except for its eyes, which tracked every movement. The work was slow and delicate, and several times Ethan had to pause when the cub shifted slightly, but finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the last piece of netting fell away. The cub stood unsteadily, shaking itself like a dog after a bath, bits of dust and debris flying from its fur. Ethan tensed, ready to grab Haley if the animal decided to bolt or, worse, become aggressive now that it was free, but the cub did neither. Instead, it took a few tentative steps toward Haley, who remained perfectly still except for her eyes, which sparkled with wonder. The cub sniffed at the stuffed star, pushing it gently with its nose, then looked directly at Haley and made a soft chirping sound, almost like a bird. Haley chirped back, or at least attempted to, the sound coming out more like a hiccup that made her giggle. The cub sat down, mirroring Haley's cross-legged position as best as a bear could manage, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Two young creatures sharing a moment of perfect understanding that transcended species and speech. Ethan found himself thinking about all the walls humans build, all the categories and divisions we create to make sense of the world. Yet here was his 2-year-old daughter, barely able to form complete sentences, having what appeared to be a meaningful exchange with a wild animal. There was something profound in the simplicity of it, something that made him wonder what else we might be missing in our rush to explain and categorize everything. He thought about the people who might be watching this story unfold, perhaps from busy cities or quiet countryside homes, from places where the morning was just beginning or where night was falling. All of us seeking connection, seeking those moments of unexpected magic that remind us the world is far more mysterious and wonderful than we usually remember. If you're watching this, he imagined himself saying, remember that sometimes the most profound connections happen when we stop trying to understand and simply allow ourselves to be present in the moment. The sound of a branch cracking outside the shed made Ethan's heart skip. He moved protectively toward Haley, but she seemed unconcerned, still focused on her new friend. Through the doorway, a shadow fell across the threshold, and Ethan's blood ran cold as he saw what cast it. A full-grown bear stood just outside, massive and powerful, her dark fur rippling as she shifted her weight. This had to be the cub's mother, and Ethan's mind raced through escape scenarios, none of which seemed remotely feasible. The mother bear was blocking the only exit, and even if she wasn't, there was no way he could run carrying Haley and expect to escape an adult bear. But as the seconds ticked by, something strange became apparent. The mother bear wasn't displaying any signs of aggression. No huffing, no pawing at the ground, no bared teeth. She simply stood there, watching, her dark eyes moving between her cub and the humans with what seemed like calm assessment rather than threat. Haley looked up at the mother bear and waved, the same casual wave she gave to neighbors and grocery store clerks. The absurdity of the gesture in this situation should have been terrifying, but somehow it wasn't. The mother bear tilted her massive head slightly, as if considering this small human greeting, then made a low, rumbling sound deep in her chest. It wasn't a growl. Not exactly. It was more like the sound Ethan remembered his grandfather's old cat making when it was content. A deep purr that you felt more than heard. The cub responded with a similar sound, smaller and higher pitched, and began moving toward its mother. But it stopped halfway, looking back at Haley and the stuffed star that still lay between them. The cub walked back, picked up the toy gently in its mouth, carried it a few feet toward its mother, then set it down and nudged it back toward Haley with its nose. It was deliberate, purposeful, like returning something borrowed with thanks. The mother bear made another sound, softer this time, and the cub finally crossed the distance to join her. They touched noses briefly, the mother sniffing her baby thoroughly, checking for injuries or distress. Finding none, she looked once more at Ethan and Haley. There was intelligence in those eyes, Ethan realized. Not human intelligence, but something equally complex, equally valid. For a long moment, all four of them existed in a bubble of perfect stillness. Predator and prey, wild and civilized, all those labels meaningless in the face of this shared moment. Then, with a dignity that seemed almost ceremonial, the mother bear turned and began walking back toward the tree line, her cub following close behind. Just before they disappeared into the foliage, the cub looked back one more time. And Ethan could have sworn he saw it attempt to recreate Haley's wave with one small paw. They sat in the shed for several more minutes after the bears had gone, neither Ethan nor Haley seeming eager to break the spell of what had just occurred. Haley picked up her stuffed star, examining it carefully as if it might have been changed by its brief journey with the cub. There was a small wet spot where the cub had held it in its mouth, and Haley touched it gently, then hugged the toy tight to her chest. Ethan pulled her into his lap, and they sat together in the dusty shed, surrounded by the debris of forgotten games, having just participated in something that felt ancient and sacred. He thought about the story they would tell, or perhaps wouldn't tell, because who would believe them? A toddler and a bear cub playing pat-a-cake in an abandoned shed while a mother bear stood guard. It sounded like a fairy tale, yet here they were, living proof that magic still existed in the margins of the everyday world. As they finally stood to leave, Haley took one last look around the shed, as if memorizing every detail. She walked to the spot where the cub had been trapped and patted the ground once more, the same rhythm she had used to calm the frightened animal. Then she reached for her father's hand, ready to return to their regular world of sippy cups and afternoon naps, but carrying with them something extraordinary. The walk home was quiet, Haley seeming tired from her adventure, content to be carried the last part of the way. Ethan found himself looking at the familiar streets and houses with new eyes, wondering what other mysteries might be hiding in plain sight. What other connections were waiting to be discovered if only we had the innocence and courage to reach out as his daughter had done. That evening, as Ethan tucked Haley into bed, she held up her stuffed star and made the same chirping sound she had shared with the cub. Then she placed the toy carefully on her pillow, patted it 3 times fast and twice slow, and closed her eyes with a smile. Ethan stood in her doorway for a long time, watching her sleep, thinking about the bears who were probably settling into their own den somewhere in the forest. He wondered if the cub would remember this day, if it would carry some memory of the small human who had shown it kindness when it was afraid and trapped. He liked to think it would, that somewhere in its wild bear life there would always be a warm memory of yellow raincoats and gentle pats, and the gift of a stuffed star freely given and graciously returned. The next morning, Ethan found himself drawn back to the tennis court. He wasn't sure why, perhaps hoping to find some evidence that yesterday had really happened, that it wasn't just a vivid dream born from too little sleep and too much imagination. The shed door was still open, the cut netting still lying where he had dropped it. But there was something else, too. In the dust near where Haley had sat, there were small paw prints and even smaller handprints, overlapping in places, creating a pattern that looked almost like a dance chart. And there, caught on a splinter of wood near the door, was a small tuft of brown fur, soft and real and undeniable. Ethan carefully freed it from the wood and put it in his pocket, a tangible reminder that sometimes the impossible happens, that connections can form across any divide if we approach with open hearts and gentle hands. Over the following weeks, Ethan and Haley returned to the park often, though they never saw the bears again. But Haley would always insist on checking the shed, patting the ground in her special rhythm, leaving small offerings of crackers or apple slices that would be gone by the next visit. Whether taken by the bears or other woodland creatures, they never knew, but Haley seemed satisfied that her message was being received. Other parents at the park began to notice the ritual, some smiling indulgently at what they assumed was childhood imagination, others asking about the story behind it. Ethan would tell them a simplified version, leaving out the parts that sounded too fantastical. But Haley would interrupt with her chirping sounds and pat-a-cake rhythms, trying in her limited vocabulary to convey the truth of what had happened. Most adults would nod and smile, the way we do when children tell us about their invisible friends or the dragons in their closets, but occasionally someone would listen with real attention, recognizing perhaps that children see things we've trained ourselves to ignore. One afternoon, an elderly woman who often sat on a bench near the tennis court stopped Ethan as he and Haley were leaving. She had been watching them for weeks, she said, watching Haley's faithful visits to the shed. Then she told them her own story, about how 50 years ago, when the tennis courts were new and gleaming, she had been a groundskeeper here. One summer, she had discovered an injured fox in that very same shed, had nursed it back to health in secret, afraid that others would insist on calling animal control. The fox had stayed for 3 weeks, she said, and even after it was healed and free to go, it would return every evening at sunset, sitting just outside the shed door like it was visiting an old friend. This went on for months until winter came and the fox stopped coming. But the next spring, it returned once more, this time with kits, as if introducing its family to the human who had shown it kindness. The old woman's eyes were bright with tears as she spoke, and she reached out to touch Haley's head gently. Some places, she said, are special. They're thin spots where the usual rules don't quite apply, where different worlds can meet and understand each other, if only for a moment. This revelation added another layer to Ethan's understanding of what had happened. Perhaps the shed, this forgotten corner of an abandoned park, was indeed one of those special places the old woman described. A place where fear could transform into trust, where communication didn't require words, where a toddler and a bear cub could recognize something fundamental in each other that transcended all the categories we use to divide the world. He thought about all the thin places that might exist, unrecognized and unacknowledged, waiting for someone with the right kind of eyes to see them. Children, perhaps, had those eyes naturally, before the world taught them what was possible and what wasn't, what was real and what was just imagination. As autumn deepened into winter, the visits to the park became less frequent, the cold making outdoor adventures less appealing for a toddler. But Haley never forgot. She would often play the patting game at home, teaching it to her dolls and stuffed animals, including the star that had become even more precious since its adventure. Sometimes, late at night, Ethan would hear her through the baby monitor making those chirping sounds in her sleep, as if she was dreaming of her friend. He wondered what she would remember of this as she grew older, whether the memory would fade into the general haze of early childhood or whether it would remain, a touchstone of wonder that would influence how she saw the world. He hoped it would be the latter, that she would always remember that she once had a conversation with a bear, that she would carry that knowledge of connection across impossible boundaries into her adult life. Winter passed slowly, each day shorter than the last, the park covered in snow that hid all traces of autumn's adventures. Ethan would drive by occasionally, seeing the tennis court buried under white, the shed door now closed by some good Samaritan or perhaps by the wind. He thought about the bears, hoping they were warm in their den, the cub growing stronger and learning all the things young bears need to know to survive in the wild. He wondered if the cub ever thought about the strange encounter in the shed. If bears had the kind of memory that held on to such things, or if it had already faded into the background of instinct and survival. But then he would remember the deliberate way the cub had returned Haley's toy, the intelligence in the mother bear's eyes, and he would think that perhaps they remembered too, in their own way. When spring finally arrived, bringing with it the muddy, messy awakening of the world, Haley was the first to ask about returning to the park. She was talking more now, her vocabulary expanding daily, though she still preferred the patting game to words when trying to communicate something important. They went on a warm April morning, the air full of birdsong and the smell of new growth. The park looked different, winter having rearranged things in subtle ways, branches down where they hadn't been before, new shoots pushing up through last year's dead grass. The tennis court was still there, of course, eternal in its abandonment. And the shed door stood open again, whether from wind or human hands unknown. Haley ran to it with the confidence of a 3-year-old now, no longer toddling but moving with purpose and determination. Inside, everything was much the same, perhaps a bit more weathered, a few more spider webs in the corners. But there, in the dust on the floor, were fresh tracks. Bear tracks, both large and small, as if the family had returned to visit the place where their paths had crossed with humans. Haley studied the tracks carefully, then placed her hand next to one of the smaller prints. It was bigger than it had been in autumn, the cub obviously growing, but still recognizable. She looked up at Ethan with shining eyes and began the patting game, her rhythm perfect and clear. They waited for a while, hoping perhaps for another encounter, but the forest remained quiet except for the usual sounds of spring. Finally, Haley stood and walked to her father, taking his hand. As they turned to leave, she spoke clearly, her voice carrying the wisdom that sometimes comes from the mouths of children. The bears came to remember too, she said. They came to remember us. And somehow, Ethan knew she was right. The tracks weren't from bears passing through by chance. They were deliberate, a pilgrimage to a place of shared memory, an acknowledgement that what had happened here mattered, that it was worth remembering and revisiting. They continued to visit the park throughout that spring and summer, and while they never saw the bears again, there were signs. A pile of berries left near the shed door once, too neatly arranged to be accidental. Claw marks on a tree that seemed to form a pattern similar to Haley's patting game. a tuft of fur caught on the fence at exactly Haley's eye level, as if left there on purpose. Each sign was small, easily dismissed as coincidence by a skeptical mind. But taken together they formed a message, a continuous conversation carried out in the language of traces and offerings. Other families began using the park more as the weather improved, children playing on the old equipment, teenagers hanging out on the basketball court. But the tennis court and its shed remained largely unvisited except by Haley and Ethan. As if by some unspoken agreement, it was their special place, their thin spot in the world. One day in late summer, they arrived to find a family of raccoons had taken up residence in the shed. Haley was delighted, immediately beginning her patting game, and while the raccoons didn't respond with the same understanding as the bear cub had, they didn't run away either. They watched with their masked faces and clever hands as this small human performed her ritual of connection. It was then that Ethan realized the gift his daughter had received from her encounter with the bears. It wasn't just a memory or a story to tell. It was an approach to the world, a way of being that assumed connection was possible, that communication could happen across any divide if approached with patience and open-heartedness. She had learned, at an age before fear and categories set in, that the world was full of potential friends, that kindness was a universal language, that rhythm and pattern could bridge gaps that words couldn't cross. As Haley grew older, the visits to the park became less frequent, school and other activities filling their days. But the lessons learned in that shed stayed with her. She was the child who could calm crying babies with her patting game, who could coax feral cats from hiding spots, who seemed to understand what dogs were saying with their body language. Teachers would comment on her unusual ability to mediate playground disputes, to find common ground between children who seemed to have nothing in common. And through it all, she kept her stuffed star, now threadbare and repeatedly mended, a tangible reminder of a day when the impossible became possible, when a bear and a baby found perfect understanding in an abandoned shed. Years passed, as years do, flowing like water around the fixed points of memory. Haley grew from a toddler to a child to a young woman, but she never forgot the bear cub. The story became family legend, told at gatherings with varying degrees of belief from listeners. Some thought it was exaggerated, a kernel of truth wrapped in layers of imagination. Others, particularly those who had seen Haley's way with animals, believed every word. But for Haley herself, it was simply something that had happened, as real and solid as any other memory from childhood. She would sometimes dream about it, the dreams varying in detail but always containing the essential elements, the rhythm, the connection, the gift given and returned. The mother bear's watchful presence that had felt more like blessing than threat. When Haley was in college, studying environmental science with a focus on animal behavior, she wrote a paper about interspecies communication that drew heavily on her childhood experience. Her professor was skeptical at first, suggesting that memory could be unreliable. The children often confused imagination with reality. But Haley had something others didn't. Her father had saved the tuft of fur, had taken photos of the tracks in the dust, had documented the strange encounters that followed. She presented these alongside research on bear intelligence, on their ability to learn and remember, on documented cases of bears showing what could only be described as gratitude or friendship toward humans who had helped them. The professor, intrigued despite himself, encouraged her to pursue this line of research further, to explore the boundaries of what we think we know about animal consciousness and communication. This led Haley back to the park, now truly abandoned, condemned for development that never came. The tennis court had finally collapsed in on itself, the shed reduced to a pile of weathered wood, but standing there she could still feel it, that thin place the old woman had described, that spot where worlds could meet. She set up a research project, cameras and recording equipment hidden throughout the area, hoping to document the wildlife that used this forgotten space. What she found exceeded her wildest hopes. The area had become a corridor for all sorts of animals, a safe passage through increasingly developed land. And at the center of it all, bears still came. Not often, but regularly, always pausing near where the shed had stood, sometimes for minutes at a time, as if paying respects to a memory. One night, reviewing footage from the cameras, Haley saw something that made her heart race. A bear, fully grown now but with distinctive markings she recognized, approached the pile of wood that had been the shed. It was followed by two cubs, young and playful, tumbling over each other in that way bear cubs do. The adult bear, her old friend, she was certain, led the cubs to a specific spot and sat down. Then, clear as day on the infrared camera, the bear placed its paw on the ground and patted a rhythm. 3 fast, 2 slow. The same pattern Haley had taught it all those years ago. The cubs watched, then clumsily tried to copy. Their coordination not quite there yet, but the intent clear. The adult bear was teaching them, passing on something learned in this place to the next generation. Haley watched the footage over and over, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the realization that the bear had not only remembered but had found it important enough to teach to its own young. She shared the footage with her father, now older and grayer, but still moved to tears by the evidence that their shared experience had mattered as much to the bear as it had to them. They discussed what it meant, this proof that animals could carry and transmit what could only be called cultural knowledge, that a simple rhythm taught by a toddler to a frightened cub could become part of a bear family's tradition. It challenged so many assumptions about the divide between human and animal, about what consciousness meant, about the nature of memory and meaning. But more than that, it validated something they had always felt but couldn't quite articulate, that connection, real connection, transcends all boundaries. That kindness creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see or measure. Haley's research, including the footage of the bear teaching the rhythm to its cubs, was published in several journals, sparking debate and discussion in the scientific community. Some dismissed it as anthropomorphism, reading too much into animal behavior. Others saw it as evidence of something they had long suspected, that animals were far more complex, far more capable of what we might call culture than previously believed. But for Haley, the academic arguments were secondary to the personal truth of it. She had been given a gift as a child, a glimpse into the possibility of connection across any divide, and that gift had shaped her entire life. Every choice she had made, from her studies to her career to her approach to relationships, had been influenced by that morning in the shed when she learned that communication didn't require words, that understanding could bloom in the space between species. The development of the parkland was eventually canceled, the area designated as a wildlife preserve, largely due to Haley's research showing its importance as a corridor for various species. The shed was never rebuilt, but a small plaque was placed where it had stood, reading simply, "Sometimes magic happens in forgotten places." Haley continued her work, expanding her research to include other instances of interspecies communication, always looking for those thin places where the usual rules bent a little, where connection overcame category. She never stopped doing the patting game, teaching it to her own children when they came along, passing on not just a rhythm but a way of being in the world that assumed connection was always possible if approached with an open heart. Her father, Ethan, would often accompany her on research trips, and they would sit together in blinds or observation posts, waiting and watching for those moments of magic that they knew were happening all around them, if only they had eyes to see. He would think about that morning so long ago, about his terror when he first saw the cub, his amazement at Haley's fearless approach, his awe at the mother bear's peaceful presence. It had changed him too, made him slower to judge, quicker to look for connection rather than difference. He had become known in his community as someone who could mediate disputes, who could find common ground where others saw only conflict. When asked about his approach, he would tell them about the patting game, about how his daughter had taught him that communication was about rhythm and intention more than words, about presence more than speech. The bears continued to use the preserve, generations of them now, and occasionally hikers would report strange behavior. Bears that seemed unusually calm around humans, that would sometimes pat the ground in odd rhythms before disappearing back into the forest. These reports were generally dismissed as misinterpretation or imagination, but Haley knew better. She had documented several instances of bears in the area using the rhythm, always in contexts that seemed to involve teaching or calming young cubs. It had become part of their behavioral repertoire, a tool passed down through generations, originating from a frightened cub in a tennis court shed and a toddler who knew no fear, only curiosity and kindness. One spring, nearly 30 years after the original encounter, Haley brought her own daughter, just turned 2, to the preserve. They sat where the shed had been, and Haley told the story, though she knew her daughter was too young to understand the words. But understanding, she had learned, came in many forms. She showed her daughter the patting game, those simple rhythms that had started everything. Her daughter, with the same fearless curiosity Haley had possessed at that age, immediately began patting the ground, adding her own variations, creating new patterns. They sat there for hours, grandmother, mother, and child, connected through time by a simple rhythm and the memory of a magical morning when the impossible happened. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they prepared to leave. But just as they stood, there was a rustling in the bushes at the edge of the clearing. A bear emerged, old and moving slowly, its muzzle gray with age. It looked at them for a long moment, and Haley knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that this was her bear. The cub from the shed, now in its final years. The bear sat down heavily, as if the effort of moving was almost too much, and slowly, deliberately patted the ground. 3 fast, 2 slow. Haley sat back down, tears flowing freely, and returned the rhythm. Her daughter, delighted, joined in, and for a few perfect moments 3 generations of humans and 1 old bear shared a conversation that needed no words. A connection that spanned decades and species. A perfect match that had begun in fear and tangling and had evolved into something beautiful and enduring. The bear stayed until the sun was nearly gone, then rose with obvious effort and disappeared back into the forest. Haley knew she would likely never see it again, that this had been a goodbye, a final acknowledgement of the bond they had shared. She held her daughter close, feeling the weight of the moment, the completion of a circle that had begun when she was the same age as the child in her arms. Her own mother, who had arrived to pick them up, found them there, sitting in the gathering darkness, patting rhythms on the ground and humming softly. She didn't ask questions, simply sat down and joined them, understanding that some moments were too precious for words, too perfect to dissect with explanation. They finally left as full darkness fell. 3 generations of women carrying the memory of an old bear's farewell. Haley's daughter fell asleep in the car, her small hand still occasionally tapping the rhythm against her car seat, already incorporating it into her dreams. Haley knew the pattern would continue, passed on to future generations not as a quaint family story, but as a lived truth about the possibility of connection. about the thin places in the world where magic still happened, about the importance of approaching the unknown with curiosity rather than fear. The preserve would continue to be a place where bears might tap rhythms on the ground, where the descendants of a scared cub would carry forward a lesson in trust and communication, where the boundary between human and animal would remain just a little bit more permeable than anywhere else. Years later, when Haley was old and her daughter was teaching the patting game to her own children, scientists would document what they called the rhythm behavior in the local bear population, a unique cultural trait found nowhere else in the world. They would puzzle over its origins, theorize about its function, debate its meaning. But for those who knew the story, who had been part of the continuing conversation between species, there was no mystery. It was simply the legacy of a morning when a toddler named Haley had found a scared cub in a shed and had chosen connection over fear, when a mother bear had chosen trust over aggression, when two young beings had discovered that understanding didn't require words, only openness and rhythm and the courage to reach across the divide. The preserve became a pilgrimage site of sorts for those who had heard the story and believed. They would come and sit quietly, hoping for their own moment of connection, their own thin place experience. Some claimed to have had encounters, bears that seemed to recognize something in them, that exhibited unusual calm or even playful behavior. Others simply found peace in the place, a sense that here, in this forgotten corner of the world, the usual rules were suspended, that magic was not only possible but probable. The scientific community remained divided, some embracing the evidence of cultural transmission in bears, others maintaining skeptical distance. But for those who had experienced it, who had felt the rhythm pulse through ground and air and flesh, connecting all things in a web of understanding, there was no doubt. Ethan lived to see his great-grandchildren learn the patting game, to watch them approach the world with the same open curiosity that Haley had shown that long-ago morning. He would tell them the story, each time remembering new details, the way the morning mist had looked like silver silk, the sound of the cub's first tentative response to Haley's rhythm, the weight of wonder that had settled on his shoulders as he watched his daughter and a wild animal find perfect understanding. He would show them the tuft of fur, now carefully preserved in a small frame, and the photographs of tracks in the dust, evidence that the miraculous had happened, that it could happen again if they kept their hearts open and their hands gentle. When Ethan finally passed, Haley scattered some of his ashes in the preserve, at the spot where the shed had stood. As she did, she heard it, carried on the wind, or perhaps just in her imagination, the sound of patting, rhythmic and sure. 3 fast, 2 slow, the heartbeat of a connection that transcended death as surely as it had transcended species. She smiled through her tears and patted the ground one more time, a final conversation with all the souls, human and otherwise, who had shared this thin place, who had proven that love and understanding could bloom anywhere, even in an abandoned shed on a forgotten tennis court, even between a baby and a bear, even across the years and miles, and differences that seemed to separate us, but never really could. The story spread, as stories do, changing with each telling but maintaining its essential truth. Children learned the patting game in schools, using it to calm anxiety, to build connection, to communicate when words failed. Therapists incorporated it into their practice, finding that rhythm could reach places that talking couldn't touch. The scientific documentation of the rhythm behavior in bears led to new understanding of animal cognition and culture, challenging long-held assumptions about the uniqueness of human consciousness. But beyond all the academic and practical applications, the story served as a reminder that the world was far more mysterious and connected than it appeared, that magic wasn't gone, but simply waiting in the margins. In the forgotten places, in the space between heartbeats where anything was possible. The preserve expanded over the years, protecting more land, providing safe passage for more creatures. The bears thrived there, their population growing, their unique behavior continuing through generations. Occasionally, a hiker would report a strange encounter, a bear that had approached them calmly, patted the ground in an odd rhythm, and then disappeared. These stories were collected, documented, added to the growing body of evidence that something special had happened here, was still happening, would continue to happen as long as there were those willing to sit quietly and pat rhythms on the ground, willing to believe that connection was possible across any divide, willing to approach the unknown with curiosity and kindness rather than fear. Haley's daughter became a researcher too, though her field was human psychology rather than animal behavior. She studied the effects of rhythm on communication, on how patterns could convey meaning beyond language, on the ways humans connected when words weren't available. Her work was influenced, of course, by the family story, by her own experiences in the preserve, by the understanding that had been passed down through generations that communication was about presence and intention more than vocabulary and grammar. She would often bring her research subjects to the preserve, have them sit where the shed had stood, teach them the patting game. Many reported profound experiences, moments of clarity or connection that they couldn't quite explain, but that changed how they saw the world. The old tennis court was eventually completely reclaimed by nature, trees growing where the net had once stood, wildflowers blooming through the cracks in what remained of the playing surface. But the place retained its power, its thin place quality that allowed for meetings that shouldn't be possible, for connections that defied explanation. Scientists came to study it, trying to understand what made this place special, whether there was something in the magnetic field or the lay of the land that facilitated these experiences. They found nothing unusual in their measurements, no explanation for why this place seemed to be a crossroads between worlds. But those who knew the story understood that it wasn't about the place itself, but about what had happened there, about the intention and openness that had been brought to it, about the love and trust that had soaked into the very ground. As the years turned to decades, the story of Haley and the bear became legend, the kind of tale that grandparents told grandchildren, that was shared around campfires and in quiet moments before sleep. It was embellished and altered, turned into children's books and animated films, analyzed in academic papers and discussed in philosophy classes. But at its heart, it remained simple. A scared cub and a brave toddler had found each other in a moment of need, had communicated without words, had formed a connection that transcended species and lasted lifetimes. It was proof, for those who needed it, that the world was more than material, that consciousness was more than neurons firing, that love was the fundamental force that connected all living things. Haley grew old in a house overlooking the preserve, spending her final years documenting every story, every encounter, every piece of evidence that the rhythm behavior in bears was real and meaningful. She created an archive, a collection of videos and photographs and written accounts that would survive her, that would continue to inspire and mystify future generations. She trained young researchers, teaching them not just the scientific method but the importance of openness, of being willing to see what was actually there rather than what theory said should be there. She taught them the patting game, of course, and many of them reported that it changed how they approached their work, made them more patient, more observant, more willing to wait for the magic to reveal itself. On her final visit to the preserve, Haley was accompanied by 4 generations of her family, from her elderly mother to her newest great-grandchild, barely walking. They sat in a circle where the shed had stood, all of them patting the rhythm on the ground, creating a percussion that seemed to pulse with life and meaning. The forest around them grew quiet, as if listening, and then, one by one, animals began to appear at the edge of the clearing. Not just bears, but deer and rabbits, foxes and raccoons, even a few birds that landed unusually close. None of them approached directly, but all seemed to be acknowledging something, participating in something, connected by the rhythm that had started with a frightened cub and a brave little girl, and had grown to encompass so much more. As the sun set on that final visit, Haley felt complete. The story that had begun in fear and accident had become something beautiful and lasting, a legacy of connection that would outlive her, that would continue to ripple outward in ways she couldn't imagine. She looked at her family, all focused on maintaining the rhythm, and saw in them the continuation of what she had started, the promise that the thin places would always have guardians, that there would always be those willing to sit quietly and pat patterns on the ground, waiting for magic to happen. The bears would continue to come to this place, teaching their cubs the rhythm, maintaining their side of a conversation that had begun decades ago. And humans would continue to come too, drawn by stories of connection and possibility, hoping for their own moment of perfect understanding. When Haley passed away a few months later, her funeral was held at the preserve. Hundreds came, people whose lives had been touched by the story, by the research, by the simple truth that connection was possible across any boundary. As her ashes were scattered where the shed had stood, the mourners spontaneously began the patting game, the rhythm spreading through the crowd like a heartbeat, connecting all of them in shared purpose and memory. And from the forest, faint but unmistakable, came an answering rhythm, bears hidden in the trees participating in their own way, completing the conversation one more time. It was a moment of perfect synchronicity, a final proof that what had happened here was real and meaningful, and would continue long after all of them were gone. The preserve stands today as a testament to the power of connection, to the possibility of communication beyond words, to the thin places where worlds meet and understanding blooms. The shed was never rebuilt, but a simple wooden platform marks the spot, worn smooth by thousands of hands patting out rhythms, hoping for their own moment of magic. Scientists continue to study the rhythm behavior in the local bear population, documenting its variations and uses, its transmission through generations. But for most visitors, the science is secondary to the experience, to the feeling of participating in something larger than themselves, something that proves the world is more mysterious and connected than we usually remember. Children still learn the patting game, 3 fast, 2 slow, a rhythm that has spread far beyond its origins, becoming a universal signal of peaceful intention. A way to say, I see you, I mean no harm, we are connected without words. In schools and hospitals, in therapy sessions and meditation centers, the rhythm continues, carrying with it the story of a morning when the impossible happened, when fear became trust, when a baby and a bear found perfect understanding in an abandoned shed. It serves as a reminder that magic isn't gone from the world, it's simply waiting in the forgotten corners, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the willingness to approach the unknown with open hands and gentle hearts. The bears of the preserve continue to thrive, their unique culture documented and protected. A living reminder that animals are far more than we often assume, that consciousness and culture and meaning exist throughout the natural world in forms we're only beginning to understand. Occasionally, a bear will still approach humans with unusual calm, will pat out a rhythm on the ground, will seem to be continuing a conversation that began long ago. These encounters are treasured, recorded, added to the ever-growing archive of evidence that something special happened here and continues to happen, that the boundary between human and animal is more permeable than we thought. That connection is the fundamental truth underlying all existence. As the world changes, as development encroaches and climate shifts, the preserve remains a constant, a protected space where the old magic still lives, where children can learn that the world is full of friends they haven't met yet, where adults can remember what they knew before fear and category set in. The story of Haley and the bear has become more than history, more than legend. It has become a practice, a way of being in the world that assumes connection is possible, that approaches difference with curiosity rather than fear, that knows communication can happen in the space between words, in the rhythm of hands on earth, in the willingness to sit quietly and wait for understanding to bloom. And somewhere in the preserve, in a den hidden from human eyes, a mother bear teaches her cubs an old rhythm, a pattern passed down through generations, a gift from a long ago morning when a small human showed kindness to a frightened ancestor. The cubs practice, their paws clumsy at first but growing more sure, adding their own variations as all students do, making the rhythm their own while maintaining its essential truth. They will teach it to their cubs in turn, and the conversation will continue, a bridge between worlds that proves love and understanding can transcend any boundary, can survive any length of time, can bloom in any forgotten corner where hearts are open and hands are gentle. The sun sets over the preserve, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the same colors that witnessed the first meeting between Haley and the cub. The rhythm continues, in the hands of children learning to communicate beyond words, in the paws of bears maintaining their unique culture, in the heartbeats of all who understand that connection is always possible, always waiting, always just a pattern away. 3 fast, 2 slow, the pulse of understanding that started in fear and grew into love, that began with 2 youngsters and expanded to encompass generations, that proved once and forever that magic is real, that thin places exist, that perfect matches can happen between the most unlikely souls if we simply have the courage to sit down, pat out a rhythm, and wait for the answer that always, always comes.